listening to Dallas Theological Seminary's Chapel Podcast.
Would you join me in welcoming Kerby Anderson?
Well, Chaplain Bill began by praying about what happened 8 years ago, and I thought I might mention, for those of you that do like to listen to radio today, we're going to be talking a little bit about that on that show, Point of View. I have Jerry Jenkins with me. You might remember him. He is the co-author of the Left Behind series. He was in New York that day and has quite a story to tell. Also, we'll be talking with Chuck Holden, and he is a military correspondent, embedded reporter in Afghanistan, and so those will be part of the program today. One of the reasons I brought this is I know some of you do listen to me on radio. You showed up anyway. But nevertheless, we have been on a program here in Dallas, a radio station called KVTT, but by the end of the month, it will no longer exist. It has been purchased by National Public Radio, and that has been a real concern that we've seen a number of Christian stations go dark and being purchased by NPR. So right now, we're both broadcasting on KVTT as well as AM 990, and so might mention that in case some of you would like to listen to that program, or if you say, well, I've always got class between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock, you can listen to a podcast. We also have a webcast so you can watch it, and we also post the articles each day of the things that we discuss. So a lot of that is on the website, pointofview.net. So if you want to write that out, it would be a great resource for you. I'm with a group called Probe Ministries, and that's probe.org, and I think you'll find that helpful as well. Before you come to the microphones, I always like to make a few statements to kind of get us thinking, and that is maybe to ask how many of you have watched at least one YouTube video? Oh, that's what I thought. Okay. Well, I'm going to give you an assignment. If you haven't already seen it, I'm hoping that after today, you go and watch the YouTube video called Exponential Times. You can actually go to probe.org. I did a whole week of radio programs just on the YouTube video. But the idea of Exponential Times is that we are moving into a time where change is happening exponentially. There are all sorts of ways to illustrate that, but one way would be to suggest that most of you raised your hands also probably have used Google. This last year, we had 36 billion searches on Google. 3 years ago, we had 2 billion searches on Google. You can begin to see the exponential growth. Look at the number of internet devices that existed on this planet. Back in 1984, we had maybe 100 internet devices. By 1992, we had 1 million, and last year we had 1 billion, and by the end of this year, we will have 2 billion. Again, you can see that exponential growth that is taking place. If you watch the video, you'll see just when we look at the English language, we have 5 times as many English words as there were during the time of William Shakespeare. For some of you foreign students, you say, why can't we go back to the time of William Shakespeare? But again, you can see that almost everything we're seeing is exponential. Let's look worldwide. It starts out by talking about the fact that there are more children that are in China or India than there are in the United States. No big deal. But then it goes back and points out that actually there are more children who are in honor students than there are all children in the United States, because there are so many more people in India and China. And so if you realize there are more honor students in India than there are students in the United States, it kind of reminds you of the book that Thomas Friedman wrote a number of years ago called The World is Flat. And he said, you know, when I was growing up, my parents would tell me, finish your meal, finish your dinner, because there are children in India and China who are hungry for your food. He says, today I say to my daughters, finish your homework, because there are children in India and China who are hungry for your job. And so we have to understand that the world is very, very different. And so I want us to begin to think about that because you are preparing for a ministry and you are preparing for a world that is very different than the world that some of the older professors here actually ministered to. If indeed we have this exponential growth, we need to plan for the future and understand the world that we're in. A couple key verses tell us to do that. 1 Chronicles 12:32 tells us that the sons of Issachar were men who understood the times with knowledge of what Israel was to do. I think, and likewise, we need to understand our times with knowledge of what we are to do. You can go to Isaiah 32:8. But the noble man devises noble plans, and by noble plans he stands. I think we need to be planning for the future, and the future is going to be different than the present. And a wise and discerning Christian is going to be looking at the signs of the time and planning for that very different future that we're moving into. One last verse, probably a more familiar one, Proverbs 16, verse 9. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. So we can begin to look what is happening overseas, but let's for just a minute look at what is happening even here in the United States. It is interesting to see how this is changing the political arena that I find myself in so often. There are a couple of people that have been writing about this. One, Philip Longman, who would be a liberal. He calls himself a progressive and wrote a while back what he called the liberals' baby bust. And another man who works at the American Enterprise Institute, Arthur Brooks. And Arthur Brooks points out, but both of them agree with these numbers, that if you were to go out of the chapel right now and talk to 100 conservative individuals who were not related to one another, you would find that they would have among them about 208 children. If you were to go out of this chapel and talk to 100 liberal people not related to one another, they would have 147 children. Now, if you run the numbers, that ends up being basically a fertility gap of about 47%. Now, both Arthur Brooks as a conservative and Philip Longman as a liberal are saying this means that the country is going to become more conservative, because we know that even though kids will grow up in conservative homes, sometimes go off to university and give up on their conservative values, give up on their conservative theology, give up on their conservative political view, about 80% of them will pretty much stay the same. And kids in liberal households will go off to school and even go off to the workplace, and some of them will change. And so you've got sort of an 80-20 rule, but by and large, most people tend to hold to many of the same values of their parents. There are exceptions, that's the true, but the rule is the case. Well, this is why a lot of people, both on the liberal and the conservative side, are saying we're moving towards a more conservative type of view of the world, but it isn't uniform. So let me explain. First of all, if you look at each generation, the generation that is most pro-life is the youngest generation. That is, the youngest generation is more pro-life than any generation that preceded it. Now, you might say, okay, that could be in part because of their observation of abortion and maybe their concerns about pro-life issues, the pro-life message getting out. All of that is true, but there is, I think, a much more fundamental reason, and that is individuals that are pro-choice are going to, by definition, probably have less children. We have had about 50 million abortions since 1973, but they have not been uniform across the spectrum of individuals. There have been many more abortions in pro-choice homes than there have been in pro-life homes. Does that make sense? And so in a sense, you now see this next generation, the current generation, more pro-life than any generation in history. There are all sorts of ways in which we're starting to see this. Gallup poll, for example, pointed out that if you look at the numbers, at least 51% of Americans last year, when asked, are you pro-life, pro-choice, don't know, 51% said I'm pro-life. So that is changing the dynamic pretty significantly. On the other hand, this isn't uniform, because if you were to look at the issue, say, of homosexuality, the author of one of the books I authored, you would find that the younger you are, the more likely you are to see homosexuality as an alternative lifestyle rather than a sin. And that, I think, is due in large part to what we might call the tolerance gospel. Used to be, even in churches, that the most quoted verse, and even outside of churches, the most quoted verse would be John 3:16. I'm thinking now that the most quoted verse I'm running into is Matthew 7:1. Judge not that you might not be judged. Even though that might be a misunderstanding of the verse, there is this idea that we can't judge, can't make judgments, can't make moral judgments. And so on the one hand, this youngest generation is the most pro-life generation, but on the other hand, most likely to accept the issue of homosexuality as an alternative lifestyle. One more that I might put on the table, and then if you want to start coming to the microphones, you can do so, and that has to do with the fact that we're also recognizing that the youngest generation tends to be one of the most skeptical generations. If you look at the four major generations, the builder generation, those born before the end of World War II, the boomer generation, those born between 1946 and 1964, the buster generation, those born between 1964 and 1982, and then the millennial generation after that, you will find that the younger you are, the more likely you are to be an atheist. As a matter of fact, millennials tend to be 3 times more likely to be an atheist than boomers or builders. It's not by accident that if you look at some of the best-selling books on the New York Times bestseller list, they're by the so-called New Atheist. Richard Dawkins, The God Delusion. Samuel Harris, A Letter to a Christian Nation. Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, God is Not Good. And so we can also see that that's a great challenge as well. So in a sense, what we are trying to do here at the seminary is prepare you for a world where the changeless word is going into a changing world. The gospel remains the same, but the way in which we communicate it and the audience that we are communicating it to is very, very different. Some of you like to come to the microphone and ask a question on this or other things, please do so. And while I'm having somebody come up here, let me take one more birthrate issue, which relates to my book on Islam. And that is, if you look at our country, we look right now have a fertility rate of 2.1. You need about 2.1 children to replace your population. I've never seen a 0.1 child. I don't think you ever have either. But take all the children born, divided of women of reproductive age, you get 2.1. We're at reproductive replacement, due not only to the birth rate, but to immigration. If you go to Europe, very, very different. The fertility rate in Europe is 1.38 in the EU. Some countries like Spain, 1.1, Germany, 1.3. Even if you go to places in France, it's 1.8, but it still isn't 2.1, with one exception. If you look at just resident French, it's less than 1.8. But if you look at certain areas in France where you have Muslims, in some places it's as high as 8.1. Now the difference between 1.8 and 8.1, you can start figuring it out. This is why more and more people have said, you know, if they take these numbers and play themselves out, it will suggest that indeed, Europe will be much more Muslim than Christian. It's already been sort of post-Christian as well. And there are places you can go to Europe and in the UK right now where you have more mosques than you have churches. So another great challenge, I believe, is just as we have seen today on the anniversary of this very significant event that took place, that there has been a conflict between the West and Islam. We also, I think, are going to, in the church, see that there will always be a conflict between Christianity and Islam. And if you look at many of the closed countries in the so-called 1040 window, a lot of them are Muslim countries. And so that, again, is one of the great challenges that we're going to face in the 21st century. Let's start with our first question.
Hi. Could you tell us a little bit of what kind of movement there's been on the International Child Treaty here in the United States? There's so many other things in the news, how close we are to ratifying that perhaps, and how that will change how we minister and raise youth here in the U.S.?
There are a number of treaties that have been proposed and need to be ratified by the United States Senate. One of those is CEDAW, another one is another one's called the Law of the Sea Treaty, and one has to do with the International Treaty for the Rights of a Child. The question has always been, would indeed any of those treaties be ratified by the previous Senates? And the bottom line was during the 1990s, the individual who had the committee chairmanship for those particular treaties was an individual from North Carolina who was very hostile to those treaties, so there wasn't really a chance that any of those would be actually removed. Now, the fact that you no longer have a chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee that is as hostile, it's quite possible that one of those treaties could be passed out of committee and ratified by the Senate. We have a number of treaties. Another one I might mention would be the Kyoto Treaty having to do with greenhouse gases, that in many cases are actually just languishing there. They have been signed maybe by the president, but unless they are ratified by the Senate, they are not in effect. Your question is, what if indeed it was ratified, how would that affect it? And I think it would affect the way in which we raise our children in a number of ways. Many would believe that this idea of child discipline, spanking a child, might be seen as child abuse. Some believe that it would provide many more rights for children against their parents. And so you can begin to see right now that this is a kind of a big issue. Right now we're fighting a number of parental rights issues. In the state of New Hampshire right now, we have a homeschooled child who was ordered by the court to go to the public schools because she was so good at apologetics, they felt that that she was rigid in her Christian faith and thought that it would be good for her to go to the public schools in order to maybe loosen her up a little bit. And so that's a case we talked about last week, and we'll probably talk about again today on Point of View, because we've been following this case through the Alliance Defense Fund. But on the other side, you have a Muslim girl in Ohio who has escaped to a Christian couple in Florida. In this case, I would say that maybe we would want to give her some rights, because she's fearful, because she is converted from Islam to Christianity, that she might be subject to an honor killing. And we've had one even here in the state of Texas. So the issue of parental rights and children's rights are difficult enough to balance, but when you have an international treaty looking over your head and changing the way in which we interpret our own law, I think there's some real concerns about that. Yes, sir.
How do we handle as Christians the exponential growth, that the ideas of how just this world's spinning so fast now? How as Christians do we help those next generations that are in the midst of that? The young people today, have all this technology, all these things going on. How do we minister to them and maybe somehow slow down their world, but then also stay connected to them, not trying to change them into, what it was in the beginning of the 20th century or something like that?
Okay, very good question, because indeed we have a technological generation. It's now, I think, been made the case that even millennials tend to think a little bit differently than the previous generation, in part because of technology. They've done MRIs and show that their brain is slightly different. So technology is having an impact, and it seems to me that if you are a pastor, or if you're a Sunday school leader, or you're working in a parachurch organizations, one of the first things we need to do is warn people about the overexposure of technology. If you go to our website, probe.org, you'll see that I have a week of radio programs we did on what I call the media storm, because we live in a world that is very different in just one generation, certainly very different than 2 generations ago. The average young person, by the time he or she graduates from high school, will have seen 22,000 hours of television. 22,000 hours of television. They've only been in a classroom about 15,000 hours, so they will have spent more time in front of a TV screen than they will actually in a classroom. The Journal of the American Medical Association says that the average teenager listens to, in round numbers, about 11,000 hours of music during their teen years. And that study was done before the iPod was really proliferating in society. So I suspect that number's gone up a little bit. The numbers that they're trying to get for internet connection are difficult, because a lot of that have to do with diaries and surveys and things like that. Best number I've seen so far is about 13,000 hours. And that number is increasing every year, because if you think about that, the average high school senior probably was born, would you think about 1991, 92, that area, and there wasn't a great deal of internet penetration there. Al Gore hadn't invented it yet. So, you just didn't have that going on. Then you add to that video games, you add to it all the other kinds of things that are taking place, the social networks, MySpace and Facebook and Twitter and on and on. You are talking about an oversaturated generation. And it seems to me that one of the things we can begin to do is, if we're talking to parents, warn them about the dangers, because I think you can make a case from all sorts of data, written in some cases by people who could not possibly sign the doctrinal statement of Dallas Seminary. Some of the people doing this research are very secular, but they're also warning about the dangers. So we could warn the parents, but we also could challenge the children that you are ministering to, the youth, to disconnect. There's not enough think time, there's not enough processing time taking place, and that is very significant as well. That being said, I also think that any of us that want to communicate, we recognize that this is a much more technological and visual generation. If I were in a typical DTS class, I probably would have just shown the Exponential Times video real quickly just to start off the conversation. But since time is of the essence here, I didn't. But I think it's going to require us to find ways to connect with individuals. And at the same time, we talk about the need to disconnect from technology. There's also the need for them to develop relationships. We have a whole generation growing up now that says, oh, I got lots of friends. I've friended people today on Facebook. No, you didn't have a face-to-face conversation. And I've had many say, even if I'm in the same room with somebody, I'll just text them rather than talk to them. There's something seriously wrong with some of that. So there are all sorts of, I think, creative things that can and should be done. One last plug, if I can make it, and then we'll go to the next question. I think it also illustrates the value of retreats, the value of Christian camps. Pastor and I were just talking about, he was at Pine Cove this summer, I was at Camp of the Woods this summer. There is something that happens at Christian camps that happen nowhere else, and I think in part is because you disconnect them from this media world, help them reevaluate their priorities, and maybe get a chance to really get some good face-to-face communication. So those are just a few suggestions, but let's go to another question.
Yeah, I came to know a guy who graduated from high school in '38, and just in terms of the culture and the way he grew up, and just trying to understand the emphasis or what happens when parents spend very little time with their children. How huge of an impact is that in terms of children actually not having time with any sort of authority figure, but kind of left to themselves? How big of an impact do you think that is?
Well, I think it's very big. Again, the question for those of you who probably already heard it, but just in case, was just about the impact of not spending time with parents. A while back, I wrote a book, I think that was in the Signs of Warning book, where they actually asked parents, how much time do you spend with your children? And then they, back then, hooked up little microphones, very small microphones, and then recorded how much time. And as you might guess, parents thought they spent this much time with their kids, they actually spent that much time with their kids. And interestingly enough, they said that if you sorted out just the obligatory parental things you say every day, did you do your homework, take out the garbage, you need to get up in the morning, all those, down to something that was actually meaningful communication, sometimes in the days you could count it on the basis of seconds rather than minutes. Now, tell me, does that make sense in terms of parenting? Again, there is an obvious application point. I'm real big on application points, and one of those is that I think we need to educate parents about the fact that you cannot parent on autopilot. You cannot parent on cruise control. And the sad reality is that if there was ever a time when that might have been possible, that happened generations ago. I was growing up, I guess I should say this. I was born in Berkeley, California. Berkeley, California. Not exactly Dallas, Texas, but you know what? Every parent was involved in their kids, and even in the midst of all the radicalism of the 1960s, I should say, and the 70s and things like that, still, nevertheless, there were two parents. Parents were involved, parents were ministering to their kids. And if you really even strayed a little bit, there were all sorts of social forces driving you back into the middle. Even in Berkeley, California, it was amazing. The kids that were doing drugs, they were kind of seen as extreme, and the kids that were disobedient to the parents, and there were all sorts of forces forcing you back to the morality of the day. And so the forces on a family at that time were sort of gravitational. They just pulled you back. The forces on a society today, on the family, are centrifugal. They're pulling you away from the family. We mentioned just technology, but look at all the other kinds of images that they see. And so I think we have to, again, educate parents that they need to be parents. They're not their kids' buddies, they're parents, and they need to start acting like it.
I have two separate questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
The first had to do with your opening statement about the outcomes of conservative versus liberal just based on the sheer numbers. But given the dynamics of, and especially that things are exponentially changing in our postmodern culture, could it be that the impact of the liberal-based homes, that even though the numbers are significantly lower, have a much more incremental impact, so that when you look at the statistics of even kids between the ages of 18 and 24 that are, that percentage that are leaving the church in the midst of all of these dynamics, could it be that the impact of the liberal platform is going to have it's going to be much more significant than the conservative platform, and maybe, and I say that because I question whether we truly are going into we can see a more conservative agenda, because
Sure.
I don't see it.
And I wouldn't
that
disagree
way.
with that. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of people that are saying that, especially those on the progressive liberal side, saying, if we're going to be successful, if we're going to have a successful election in 2012, because a lot of them thought this may be the last time. And so we have a candidate that was a phenomenal candidate in the sense that it was kind of revolutionary, the first time a person of color runs for president, and there was a desire for hope and change. There was a dissatisfaction with the previous administration. But they're looking down the road saying, even the progressives are saying, we've got to come up with some ways to convert some people over, or we're not going to win so many congressional elections, we're not going to win so many presidential elections. And so they're hoping, in a sense, the media does that. Now, the bottom line is that the media tends to be generally much more progressive liberal than it is conservative. There are the exceptions, talk radio, certain cable programs and the rest, but that tends to be the case. But even in the midst of that, the demographics seem to be working against them. As one person put it, Peter Berger in Boston, a sociologist, he said, we really have a break and a significant break between the media and the academy and the culture. Now, understand his point of view, what he was trying to explain. You have to understand that Sweden is considered to be one of the most secular countries in the developed world. India is considered to be one of the most religious. And in order to illustrate his point, Peter Berger said, we have a nation of Indians ruled by Swedes. A nation of Indians ruled by Swedes. In other words, if you turned on television or if you went to a major university today, you would think the country was very liberal progressive. But if you went out to the hinterland of America, you see they were fairly conservative. Now, I'm just talking politically, but let me come back to the point you made about churches. While they're conservative, they aren't biblical. And that's another point. Almost every study, George Barna's classic study, a more recent one that was commissioned by Josh McDowell by George Barna of youth, found that in general, almost all young people today grow up with a belief in relativism, that it's a very small minority of young people that believe in absolute truth. Well, if you don't believe in absolute truth, you probably don't believe in biblical truth. So there, I think, illustrates the fact that you can't always equate political with theology. They may be somewhat conservative politically, and they may have some aspects of their theology that's conservative, but the sad reality is most of their theology is more sort of cafeteria style. I take a little here, I take a little there. Oprah said something nice, I like that. I heard something nice in the church, and Rick Warren said that, and Brian McLaren said that, and eventually I have my theology, which, makes almost every one of you in the room's teeth ache when you think about what you've had to go through in systematic theology. But that's unfortunately where a lot of young people's theology is today.
Right. And actually that feeds into my second question, which has to do with, as much as we're seeing this exponential change, how is that going to, how does that change the way that we convey biblical truth?
What was that last word?
Convey.
Convey truth?
Yes.
Well, and I think that's the point. Again, if you hear my application point, it seems to me that we need to take people back to, if you will, almost an apologetic for truth, for the fact that there is absolute truth. And we live in a culture today where everybody says, well, all truth is relative. It's like the young kid that came up to me one day and says, I believe everything is relative. And I said, well, do you believe that that's true for everybody at all places at all times? And he said, well, sure. And I said, so you believe that all truth is relative? Absolutely. And I said, now just think about this for a minute. You just told me that there's absolutely no truth except the absolute truth that there is no absolute truth. And he kind of smiled and said, okay, you got me on that. And I said, no, this is not a parlor trick. This is not a game I'm playing. This is not word games. There is no way you can live in a world where there aren't absolute truths. Some things have to be absolutely right and absolutely wrong. And yet people today sort of buy into this in theology. They'll say, well, all religions are basically the same. No, God either exists or God does not exist. God can't exist and not exist at the same time. Can we buy that? Okay. If God does not exist, okay, maybe the new atheists are right. But if God exists, then the religions of the world may be right. God is either personal or God is impersonal. God can't be personal and impersonal at the same time. If God is personal, then the religions of the book, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, probably could be true. But the religions of the East, Hinduism, Buddhism, would be false. Jesus either is the Messiah or Jesus is not the Messiah. Somewhere along the line, you just have to come down to some basics. And I think there is a real need today to train our young people living in this culture that is postmodern and full of relative values to understand that you really can't consistently live in that world. Their worldview is not corresponding with the reality of the world. And that's one of the ways to teach that.
Okay.
Let me take a question over here, because you certainly have had a couple.
What would you like to see the baby boomer Christian generation do?
That's a tough question.
We've really blown it. So what do we need?
Well, you give me your name and address here, and when I get back to Probe, I will give you an autographed copy of my book, Signs of Warning, Signs of Hope, because it's all about baby boomers. And really what I try to do there is say that as we were really moving from the 1990s into the 21st century, I identified kind of 7 crises that baby boomers would be addressing, and we've already addressed a few of these right here. You had between 1946 and 1964, 76 million babies coming into the world, called the baby boom. Now, because of immigration, you have 78 million. And the baby boom has been kind of this huge bulge. Some sociologists said it's kind of like a pig in a python. You know, if a pig is swallowed by a python, causing no small distress to both pig and python, you know, the bulge moves on. Well, you know, as that bulge moved through the 1950s, diaper industry revenues doubled overnight. 2 million cans of baby food were consumed every single year. As they moved into the 1960s, they were crowding the schools, they were moving to the college, it was very competitive time. As they moved into the 1970s, they went out to buy houses, and we had the house prices rise incredibly. Now you have, you know, as they moved to the 80s and 90s, now you have the leading edge of the baby boom generation that is now moving towards retirement. And I think what I would want to do is say, okay, now most baby boomers are in their 60s, their 50s, or their 40s. And it seems to me that now is a time to ask yourself, as a believer at least, what can I do to give back? Various people like Bob Buford's book, A Halftime, says, you know, a lot of people spend the first half of their life trying to be successful, trying to build success. The last half trying to build for significance. And now is an opportunity to say, as I'm entering retirement, as I might have more free time, maybe as my kids leave home, this would be a dynamic time for ministry. So I really would say that this would be a great challenge to the baby boom generation, which up until now collectively has been more inward focused than outward focused. There are exceptions to that. I mean, this was a generation that joined the Peace Corps and other things, so and certainly got involved in various social movements and was instrumental ultimately in building organizations like Campus Crusade for Christ. And so I'm not minimizing that, but as a general rule, have been more inward focused. But now would be a time to say, what can I do to give back and to pour my values into the next generation coming behind us? So that's my quick answer, but I'll be glad to send you a book. Let me take a question behind you here, and then we'll see if I can go for a few more minutes. Yeah, these will be the last 2. So 1, 2.
Sure, if I generalize it too much, my apology. But it seems like when I look at the facade of it, a lot of conservatives seems like they excel among the believers, and they come across as very holy, very sacred among the believers. But it just seems like they are separated from the world. On the other side, if I look at some liberals who are very exposed to all the technology and all that, they're great at it. They make such a great testimony among the world and have a great friends with people. But among the Christian realm, it almost seems like, whoa, they are a little too much. So for our generation and for the next generation, what's the key factor or value that can determine be in the world so that we can be a light and really salt in the world, yet not of the world?
Very good. And a tough question to answer, but I'll give you a couple of ideas. First of all, I think it is important for you to read widely, and so that's going to help you understand that, and read with discernment. So I would encourage you to do some reading outside of what you're doing right now. And I've suggested before that it would be good, whether you're going into the pastorate, whether you're going into Christian ministry or going to be a missionary, whatever you might do, to at least get some Christian periodical. Now, some people say, well, I really want to learn the theological stuff, so maybe it's Christianity Today or Leadership. But if you really want to understand the issues in the world, one thing that I always recommend is World Magazine, because I think they do a very good job. Joel Beltz is the publisher. The editor is Marvin Olasky. They have a number of writers, and I think that's a way to really understand what's kind of going on in the world, but from a Christian point of view. So first of all, I think to be able to learn a little bit more about what's going on in the culture helps you maybe to watch for some of the dangers in the cultures that might be affecting you, your church, your ministry. Number 2, I hope that you would develop, even as you leave here, some kind of accountability structure that allows individuals to maybe hold you accountable so that, you know, there is, as the Proverbs say, wisdom in many counselors. And so certainly you can be a wise and discerning believer, but the Christian life is to be lived in community, not isolated. And so I think that would be very key as well. Somebody can say, you know, I think you're becoming too worldly. There used to be a concern that individuals were too separated from society. The fundamentalist movement was, how high are my walls? How far can I separate from the world? Well, even if you could find a place where that happens anymore, the technology is intruding. So if anything, there is a danger of being, using Romans 12:1 and 2, being conformed to this world rather than transformed by the renewing of our minds. And I think by spending time in the Word, spending time with other believers who can hold you accountable, that's another way to prevent from being too worldly. Last question here.
Good morning. I just wanted to ask a question about the family. It seems like in the past the nuclear family has been the basis, and the church has been founded on that. But with kind of changes in terms of divorce and blended families, how does that affect the way the church ministers? And particularly, how does that affect the way we pass on the faith to children and youth?
Yes. It's one of the questions that I was going to address. Matter of fact, one of my first statistics was going to be the changing demographics today, because we went from a time where in the 1960s, cohabitation, you couldn't find more than 500,000 cohabiting couples in America. During the 1970s, maybe you get up to 1 million. And part of this is because the Census Bureau wasn't asking the best questions in the world. By the 1980s, you get to be about 5 million. Now we have 10 million cohabiting couples of the opposite sex and another 2 million of the same sex. So we have 12 million cohabiting couples. So first of all, the issue of living together has gone off the charts. At the same period of time, from 1969 to 1981, the divorce rate virtually doubled. And again, I'll make the same offer to you. If you give me your name and address, I'll give you my book, Signs of Warning, Signs of Home, where I show you those incredible increases in divorce, in cohabitation, and the rest. And so what has happened is where intact families were the rule, now broken families are the rule. And so there is kind of this growing uncomfortable insecurity that young people are facing. So it seems to me that we need to, again, come back to biblical principles. From the pulpit, we need to talk about the importance of marriage for life. We need to talk about the importance of marriage. And on our website, one of the things I did a number of years ago was put together whole weeks of radio programs on, for example, cohabitation, because in my D-Min class, I would have pastors come in and say, I've got a number of couples in my church that are living together. I give them the biblical verses and they all go, well, yeah, but is there any studies that say that this is wrong? And the bottom line is, yes, there is. And again, to use my illustration a minute ago, there are people, some of whom I've even interviewed on my program, that by no stretch of the imagination could sign the doctrinal statement of Dallas Theological Seminary. Very secular people that are all saying that if you live together before marriage, you increase dramatically all sorts of problems that are going to happen in that relationship and increase dramatically your likelihood of divorce. Well, it seems to me that we can come back and say, this is what the Bible says, but you know what? This is what social science says as well. And yet today we sort of bought into this idea, well, we can just, live together for a while. It's kind of a test drive relationship. I mean, you wouldn't buy a car without test driving the car. You wouldn't put on a pair of shoes without test driving shoes. Well, the problem with that is that if you test drive a car and decide not to take it, you don't leave all your personal belongings in the trunk of the car. And the car doesn't feel rejected by you. And so there are all sorts of very good arguments. And the good news is, in the 21st century, more and more, I'm seeing biblical statements and data from sociology converging. So it isn't that we're saying, well, you need to obey the Bible even though sociology disagrees. No, it's you need to obey the Bible, and guess what? Sociology says the same thing God's Word says, and that's good news. Thank you.